Okay, so we're going to talk about something called market failure and the case for protectionism. We're in chapter 10 of your textbook right now, and we're going to start out in a world where there is no market failure. This is a diagram is familiar from principles of microeconomics. We have a demand curve and a supply curve. We have an equilibrium, price and quantity. Under some conditions, this is considered the socially optimal output and quantity produced for this good, and the conditions are that we've reached a point where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. We know that because we've reached the intersection of the demand and supply curve. So we have price equals marginal benefit equals marginal cost, and then importantly for a first best world, social marginal benefit is equal to marginal benefit or private marginal benefit, and social marginal cost is equal to the marginal cost experienced by the private producer. So this is called a first best world, and this is the argument you get for why free markets should be left to their own behavior. There's essentially an assumption that most markets look like this. And then what happens if we introduce a trading partner to this world? So let's say we're going to be an importing country. Let's bring in a foreign supplier with an attractively low price relative to the autarky equilibrium price. So this is the price experienced on the world market. Then as long as, as you can see here, that we have the price on the world market, as long as this is also true that the social marginal cost abroad is equal to the private marginal cost abroad, then if this supply curve also satisfies those conditions, then it must be true that the first best world and the socially optimal output is to have a price of PW prevail in this market and have consumers buy, say, Q2 amount of the good, and the domestic industry should shrink and supply Q1 of the good. So now this is the first best world. And then the question in this that is asked in this chapter is, well, what if we don't live in a first best world? We live in something that Lipsey and Lancaster described as a second best world. And a second best world, we'll do the sort of simple case from the point of view of our world, is a world where maybe we have externalities. So an externality is something that is when the social marginal cost, say, is not equal to the private marginal cost. So I buy cigarettes and I pay, I don't know, whatever they cost, a certain amount per packet, but then I impose costs on other people. So we have a second best world where we don't, as a private individual, we don't care about the costs we impose on other people. And then likewise, if there are things we buy that are helpful, like getting a flu shot, we also don't take into account the benefits that accrue to other people when we get a flu shot. So we're in a second best world. So let's suppose that there are externalities, and let's make them positive externalities because we're coming up with a rationale for putting a tariff on this industry. There are positive externalities associated with the supply of this good in the home country. So not externalities associated with consumption, like maybe flu shots. Perhaps that would tell us we should import more of them if the externality is associated with the consumption of the good. But there are positive externalities associated with the production of this good in the home country. Maybe we avoid social strife. Unemployment is associated with social problems. So we actually want to keep this industry going so that if this industry contracts, we experience costs. And so the second best world says that it may be appropriate to, if we have what's called a market failure, which is this market failure occurs because this marginal cost is not equal to the social marginal cost, or the marginal benefit of the good is not equal to the social marginal benefit. We call these situations when that arises market failure. That if we have market failure in one sense in this industry, then maybe we should introduce an offsetting market failure in the form of a tariff to restore the industry to some socially optimal level of output. So if we put a tariff on, we can cause the industry to expand, enabling us to reap the benefits of the extra production. And in your book, I take so long to get my ruler out, but I could try. In your book, then you have a little diagram below your demand and supply diagram. This is what's called a marginal external benefits curve, which is associated with making the benefits that come from this industry being larger. So if a tariff, for example, caused the domestic industry to expand from Q1 maybe to, how about Q prime, and then you can find out what the total benefits associated with that expansion are by integrating under this curve. And you can find this amount here, and this area is the total external benefits of causing this industry to expand. And we know that tariffs make industries expand, so maybe in the second best world that we live in, where the actual production of this good in our own country is inherently good, well, then maybe we should just suffer the known inefficiencies associated with the tariff to allow production to take place. And let's say we want the industry, we can also, if you wanted to, conceptualize it as the costs, the marginal costs in this industry are lower than they appear because there's some built-in benefits. I just don't want to move this demand curve because we're not saying that there's any marginal external benefits associated with consuming the good. It's all happening on having the good produced in the home country. So what we have here then is let's make this industry expand just like we could do with a tariff. I should get the tariff on here. We could pick the optimal tariff, optimal in the sense of the tariff that causes the industry to expand enough that we can capture those marginal external benefits associated with production. So if we put a tariff on, say, of this amount, then we can cause the industry to expand to, say, Q1 prime, as it's doing in this diagram below. And then we know that this is going to be, this small triangle here, which is getting a little small, is area B, the production effect of the tariff. But what we can do, if we believe that there are marginal external benefits, we can offset area B with these benefits here. So this is the marginal external benefits between Q1 and Q1 prime. So this area is total external benefits, and obviously in my simple diagram this is much bigger. So this becomes an argument in favor of a tariff. However, and your book goes into this in some detail, what you can also notice is, well, there was an unintended consequence of causing production to expand. We don't really have any beef with the consumers of this good. We're completely happy that they consume the good. But by putting the tariff on, in addition to causing a production effect, we cause something called the consumption effect, the inefficiency associated with consumption. So the Consumers essentially are bystanders in this case, where we wanted the domestic industry to expand so that we could capture the total external benefits associated with less unemployment, less crime, and domestic abuse. And maybe this industry innovates and the innovations spill over into the rest of the economy. But for whatever reason, we did want the industry to expand. If the industry is going to expand, we have to accept that B is forever lost. But the consumers essentially are innocent victims here. They're forced by the tariff. So this is the world supply plus the tariff. They're forced by the tariff to cut back on their consumption of the good, and that was nothing that we were essentially seeking. So then the question is there a better way to get this result? And you probably read your book. There's something in economics called the specificity rule. The specificity rule says in order to avoid these kind of bystander effects, when you're trying to intervene in the economy, intervene as close as possible to the source of the problem. And so a tariff is a bit of a blunt instrument in terms of causing an industry that has desirable external benefits to expand. This is one of the reasons that increasing the minimum wage is sometimes controversial, because it does cause a rise in the wages of poor workers, but it also causes a rise in the wages of workers who are not poor. And you're probably thinking, isn't everyone on minimum wage poor? And that answer is, well, not everyone, because poverty is defined at the level of the household, and some poor people, like teenagers who work minimum wage, actually live in households that are not poor, but you'll have spillover effects of possibly reducing the employment of teenagers whilst pursuing the admirable goal of helping the working poor who are trying to support their families. Anyway, so the specificity rule here says intervene as close as possible to the source of the problem. This is saying essentially, well, we would like the industry to expand, but do we really have to hurt the consumers? And the answer is, well, actually, no. You can have the expansion of the domestic industry without cutting consumption by consumers by just going directly for a production subsidy. And a production subsidy will have the effect of lowering the costs for the domestic industry without benefiting the foreign industry. So the production subsidy cuts the costs. So this could be like S minus the subsidy. Production subsidy cuts the costs of this industry. They operate essentially on a cost minus subsidy supply curve, so we can get them to expand to Q1 prime just like we wanted. But because the domestic industry has to match the price on the world market, they are still selling at PW, because the harm to the consumers came when the tariff caused the price of the good to rise. So because the subsidized domestic industry is still competing with a foreigner supplying at PW, they have to match that price. They expand to Q1 prime. Consumers are still confronting a price of PW, and so they continue to consume the amount that they always did. And so with a production subsidy, this thing goes away. And so you can have the total external benefits that you desire from this industry and suffer a smaller cost when you subsidize as opposed to add tariffs. So production subsidy avoids the consumption effect of the tariff. And the reason we don't have production subsidies as much as we do, though we do have some, is probably for political reasons, because a production subsidy is really obvious that you're helping an industry. Tariffs, I think for some people, I think a lot of voters maybe believe that tariffs hurt foreign suppliers, and they don't realize that tariffs hurt American consumers. So there's sort of, for political reasons, you don't see production subsidies as much as tariffs. And also, of course, if you're a politician, a tariff gives you revenue, a production subsidy costs revenue, so there's also another incentive to like tariffs, even though they might not be the best solution to living in a second best world. So you could say they're the second best solution to a second best world.